Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Oh, now this is better. So I hope some of you or most of you have been here, have been to the party last night. Who here was in the party last night? So as you remember, we had an interesting band. And I just want to make sure you all know who are these people, okay? So how many people know the term VRA here? Great. So you have the chief architect of the VRA on sax, okay? You have the lead singer, one of our really highest ranked and the expert support guy, okay? We have a guy that is doing product marketing, and lots of the product marketing things that you see is coming from him, Ryan, the guy with the beard on the guitar. We have a sales guy, an inside sales guy, and the lead singer, the female, is actually from our HR in Israel. Now, the key to understand, these are employees of Zerto from Israel and from the US, okay, that really had only 3 days to practice here, okay? And they started as, to people that don't know, they started last year as a warm-up band to a cover band. And actually, they were better than the cover band. So this year they got the whole show. And can we get a nice round of applause for the band, because I think they did an amazing work. We do very much appreciate the fact that you're actually here at 9 a.m. after a long night of partying and drinking. So we do have a great day for you today. We'll begin in a few seconds with John Morency. And after that, we have some really good sessions today, because we want to reward the people that are here today with really some deep dive sessions, both between now and the keynote, and also after the keynote. You know, we have our chief architect, Oded, our co-founder, has a session there. We have another deep dive session on backup. So really good stuff coming up in the sessions. The labs are still open. Don't forget, if you didn't certify, you want to certify, you want to try the product, that's there. The booths of the sponsors and our own Zerto booth is still there. If you want to see a demo of some of the new technologies, if you want to talk to product management, that is also happening there. Don't forget the app. You can still win points, can still do things to get yourself some cool swag out there. Don't forget to tweet the ZertoCon tweet. And also, if we could put that, I want you to remind you on Join the Resilience. We're still doing that. We got really good number of tweets. I don't have the exact number, but hundreds of tweets yesterday for Join the Resilience. And remember, every tweet or every social post, LinkedIn, wherever you want to post your post, with Join the Resilience, we will donate $5 to the Red Cross. So help us in this really good cause. Now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. John is, we and John have a very long relationship. John is a vice president in Gartner. And I think one of the important thing to understand about John is he was, we tried to kind of figure out how to describe it. It's like a lighthouse in the fog a few years ago, because, he was the one that was talking about these concepts of IT resilience, these concepts of converged data protection, disaster recovery, this concept of moving to much more of a bigger thinking about this kind of continuous availability. He was talking on stage in ZertoCon 2 years ago, and also with us, we always saw him as kind of like the guy that is kind of like pushing the boundaries there and leading the way, which makes it so evident for us to have him here again and talk about these concepts, because he's really the distinguished person that is leading this thought process in the industry. He's leading both the disaster recovery as a service Magic Quadrant in Gartner, and the new coming up IT resilience Magic Quadrant. So without further ado, I really want to thank and please welcome John Morency from Gartner. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Gil. Before I begin, Gil, I have a question for you on your metaphor. I hope you thought of me more as the lighthouse than you did the fog, but just wanted to clarify that. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Gil mentioned, my name is John Morency. I'm a research vice president at Gartner. And I've been with Gartner for about 11 years, and over the course of that time, I've had lots of opportunity to delve fairly deeply into recovery and continuity and all that. Now, if there's one thing that Gartner analysts are really good at, there's two things, right? The first is strategic planning assumptions, and we'll see a few of those. And the second is polling questions, our polling question. So I'm going to start with a polling question. How many of you here in the audience today were at ZertoCon 1 back in 2016? Show of hands. A few folks. Well, to follow on to that particular point, ZertoCon 1 was really the point at which we began the discussion, the dialogue on what IT resilience was, how it's transitioning from the traditional recovery and backup model, and where do we go from here. Now, back then, we, at least I, had a very loose sense that resilience was important, that there was a much bigger theme, especially as we look forward into software-defined infrastructures and digital business and so on and so forth. But we weren't exactly clear on what the functionality was, what the targets were, what it all meant, especially in terms of the larger transition and transformation that organizations were going through. And that's why I think it's particularly timely to talk about digital transformation and IT resilience and getting there from here. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, both my own journey over the past 2 years and discovering a lot of things and learning a lot of things from vendors, such as Zerto and others, but more importantly, understanding and presenting what are the key takeaways? What do organizations need to do, and why did they need to do it? So let's start. Like I said, polling questions and SPAs, right? Here's an interesting one. So by 2020, organizations, 55% of organizations will be participating in, managing, planning for involvement in complex ecosystems. You say, wow, that's a pretty big number. Where does that come from? Well, the short answer on the SPA is that it comes from an individual analyst or set of analysts. But in the spirit of fact-based research, one interesting supporting point on this comes from Gartner's 2018 Cio Survey. One of the largest, if not the largest survey that's ever been done, over 3,100 CIOs in 92 countries across the world. And when the question came up around digital business and ecosystem participation, about 40% said, I'm there, I'm optimizing, I'm harvesting the financial gains from participating in digital business, et cetera. Nearly 40%. So not that far away from the 55%, and we have a couple years to get there from here. But what needs to happen between now and then? So first off, a new emphasis. What needs to happen? 2 years ago, when we were here for ZertoCon 1, we were talking more about IT resilience from somewhat from a technology-centric point of view, somewhat from a services-centric point of view, but we really didn't understand, we weren't ready yet for the full implications of what digital business and digital transformation were really all about. And certainly one of the things I've seen over the past year working with my colleagues in the IO infrastructure group and the storage teams and the CIO teams and so on, that I'm learning that very much as we go forward, a lot of the emphasis, a lot of the value add around resiliency is really going to be enabling the business processes, a whole new role, a whole new set of opportunities for IT. And we'll talk about what that means in terms of service levels, in terms of partnership opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. But again, the journey now, and some of you may already be there, it's really going from the technology and services-centric model more into the business process enablement, business process improvement, and business process sustainment. That's really where we're heading there from here. And so, as a result, there's a whole set of different behaviors that are required. I do a lot of inquiries with clients where their main concerns that sometimes their IT teams may perhaps be a little bit inwardly focused. And the question then becomes, how do we get there from here? And more often than not, it really involves, sometimes it's not so much a technological change, but it's a cultural change. And you see some of the changes here in terms of outward movement and being able to deliver a new set of resilient services that aren't just available, but that can also mitigate the impacts of cyber attacks, that can sustain a level of data integrity and continuity over this massive ecosystem infrastructure, and also can become agile in terms of more of a just-in-time provisioning model. Back in 2016, we weren't even talking about agility. When we were discussing resilience, mostly it was in the context of, yeah, continuous availability, and then there's continuous availability, and then there's on and on and on. It's changed. The definition has changed. The scope has changed. And what's happening is that is causing many organizations, infrastructure organizations, and management software organizations to evolve their products in an entirely different way. And so that's what we're here to talk about today. Different emphases in terms of recovery management to resilience management, and also a different focus inward to outward, and an emphasis on business process-centric service level management. Okay, so those are the objectives. What's the current state? The results you see here on the bar chart were taken from a polling conducted at the Keynote session at Gartner's Infrastructure and Operations and Data Center Summit back in December of 2017. And one of the key questions that the attendees were asked was, what are your most significant challenges in not only evolving your data center infrastructure, but also supporting digital transformation? And you see a lot of the obvious candidates here in terms of understanding how to work with private cloud, perhaps cloudifying the private infrastructure, getting the right talent, being able to align better with business objectives. But surprisingly, one of the key areas that comes in, and still comes in after all these years, is the challenge of modernizing recovery and continuity. But there's a big difference. Recovery and continuity modernization today does not have the same meaning that it had even a few years ago. Because a few years ago, recovery, continuity, and modernization really meant deploying new technologies, new processes, primarily to support the internal environment. Whereas today, if we look at the challenge and the opportunity around digital transformation, it's really both inward and outward, but also what does that mean in terms of supporting an entirely new set of service level commitments? And by the way, also properly identifying who is responsible and accountable for delivering this stuff. Talk about that a little more as well. So those are the recovery and continuity challenges. Let's start with something a little more basic. Fact. What is the term most commonly used in the industry when the discussion is around recovery and continuity? And yes, you guessed it, backup. some stats. When you look at the inquiry volume in Gartner, and this has been true over the last few years, for every inquiry that we take on recovery and continuity, we get roughly 3 questions on backup. So backup's significant. It's very broad. It's a large industry, nearly $7 billion, projected to grow about 5-7% through 2022. But if we're talking about backup and digital transformation, how well will that technology move forward? In fact, one of the key questions is, can backup technology by itself deliver recovery and continuity modernization? And given some of the objectives, given the transitions that we talked about, we thought the most appropriate metaphor was Mr. Scott on the Enterprise saying, I'm giving it all she can, Captain. And that's not a criticism of backup providers. Backup did a very good job with what it was intended to do. But when we look at the challenge of data protection, integrity management, cyber attack impact mitigation, backup can only take us so far. And it has to be complemented and supplemented by technology that focuses on that level of sustained resiliency across the hybrid infrastructure. So, what does that mean? Well, another strategic planning assumption. What we've also seen in the background, independent of digital transformation, is that there has been some concerns, questions regarding backup capabilities. Is it cost-effective enough? Is it too complex? And you can see the strategic planning assumption here that my colleague Dave Russell put together on the rate of change that will happen between the beginning of this year and 2021 or 2022 on the rate of change relative to backup technology. And more importantly, in another survey, Gartner works with an organization called the Gartner Research Circle, which is a virtual organization of IT leaders spread across the world who work with us on addressing or providing real-time input on a number of key issues. And so one of the key issues in one particular survey, it was about a year ago, was what is the stickiness of backup? How willing are organizations to look at something different, and just in the context of day-to-day data center operations? And what we see here is that almost half, 47%, said, more or less content with what I have. Others saying, have concerns, willing to look. Others say, yep, you know what, guess what, got to do it. Now, that's a Research Circle survey, April 2017. Let's go to fact-based and leverage some of the data that we collected on the floor at the IODC Summit in December of 2017. Result number 1. We saw in the SPA, it was about the interest, the potential change was 40%. When we did the session polling in the backup sessions, that number had risen up to about 42%. So pretty close, pretty close. So in other words, it was validation, sampling of what was really going on versus what we think was going on. And the other part of it, too, is at the IODC, we had on the floor a kiosk, a polling kiosk, in which we asked attendees from organizations of different size, what are your main challenges with respect to managing the backup function? And so there are sets of results that that came out, but more importantly, for organizations that were 1,000 employees and larger, you see cost and complexity showing up as the key issues. When you look at organizations of mid-size, it's really around speed, performance, as being the key considerations. And there are a couple of other related issues in terms of the reliability, the availability, the consistency of backup. And that turns out to be very relevant, especially in the case of recovering from cyber attacks. So, thus, transition into another strategic planning assumption. And you can see the SPA there in terms of 30% of organizations using backup with varying degrees of success to recover from cyber attacks. And I think Zeev made the point during his keynote, and I agree with him, is that if you haven't been attacked already, you will be sooner rather than later. And so, in the aftermath of the Sony Pictures hack attack in late 2014, early 2015, cyber attack mitigation, contingency management has come front and center to being a mainstream item on the plate of infrastructure and operations and recovery and continuity managers by implication. So, what does this all mean? Well, from a product capability point of view, what I've seen from my vantage point, especially as it relates to data protection both within the enterprise and across the virtual infrastructure, across the ecosystem, the criteria are radically changing. In the past, functionality trumped total cost of ownership, but today, rolling up using the results from the polling kiosk as a guide, what we're seeing is that, look, the real capabilities, the real discriminating criteria are threefold. They're cost, complexity, and capability. What can you do? How can you do it? How broadly can you do it? How complex is it to get you to do it? And how much does it cost me in order to make sure that you do it? And that's what it's really boiled down to. And that's why we're seeing such a transformation in terms of not only what backup vendors are offering, but other types of vendors as well. Cloud management platforms, runbook automation vendors, software-defined managers, and so on. And we'll get back to that point in a little bit. So what does that all mean from what the IT team needs to do? What's the path that it's on? Well, you could see the path here. That's the logical progression from starting with determining or implementing the cloudification of not only the internal infrastructure, but also ensuring that whatever is done in terms of cloud services for the internal infrastructure can be readily evolved and supported within the public cloud. Back in 2016, I don't think we had anybody who had a consistent set of application portability, workload portability, resource allocation mechanisms that were consistently managed between the prem and the cloud. The other part of it is it's not just ensuring that the infrastructure functionality is consistent, but more importantly, it's all about the application, stupid, and I'm not directing that at anybody here, but to quote a former president, it's a helpful thing to use as a point of emphasis. Because what's really happened, especially with software-defined, is that while you had a lot of initial adoption around change and provisioning management and cost of ownership, especially with hyperconverged for storage, and at the network level and at the server level, and those are all great benefits. But in terms of digital transformation, those benefits may have been necessary, but by no means were they sufficient. And the sufficient part comes in when you have the capability to have a single way of developing applications, a way to port those applications, workload mobility between prem and cloud. And that's why we see such an acceleration in the deployment of technologies like containers and microservices and so on, as opposed to more traditional VMs. Traditional VMs will continue to be around, we know that, but it's just the rate of increased deployment for containers and microservices and so on has also been quite striking. And that's really where the benefit is from the business's standpoint. Really the write once, deploy many model, to the extent that that's possible. And I realize, easier said than done. So, now this has major implications. If we're talking about application mobility, freedom of deployment, et cetera, and we're looking at that in the context of a complex ecosystem, what does that all mean? What are the implications? Well, take a simple model. We're looking at a model of an IT operations team within a logical model of an ecosystem. You're here, your customer is way over here, and by the way, the data that you need for fulfilling that service fulfillment, that product fulfillment is way over here. And here may be an internal data center, it may be a colo, it may be an intelligent edge that's supporting IoT. Obviously, the distribution potential, the distribution flexibility is quite large. And that's a big challenge. Now, it's one thing for me as an analyst to say that's a big challenge. It's another thing to hear it from the perspective of someone who actually has to make this stuff work. And in order to do that, I'd like to ask my colleague, Jamie Williams from Tenkata, to join me on the stage right now. Jamie is a senior systems engineer at Tenkata, and appropriately enough, Tenkata is in the business of developing and delivering, you guessed it, protective fibers that can be used by our military, that can be used by our public service, police, emergency staff, but over time, they'll be delivering fabrics and intelligence for us, the rest of us as well. And so, all that said, Jamie, I'd like to start by just getting your perspective on how you've seen Tenkata's business grow just over the past year. I know you and I had a particular context a year ago, and when I spoke to you again, it's like, holy cow, Jamie's dealing with a fair level of growth. So I was wondering if you could share that with the attendees.
Absolutely. So just a short period of time ago at the Gartner event, Tenkata, our vision was set forth in the past to become cloud-centric. So our vision was to be in two clouds, public, private, public. Turned out to be Azure AWS. That's where we were moving to. We have workloads in each. Since that time in Vegas, we're now involved with 7 different cloud providers, public, private. So we're living this dream or nightmare, whichever way you want to define it. It's fun, but it's also a mental challenge because we, being the disciples of change, adoption, agility, are ourselves in IT often resistant to that very thing. So it has changed in 6 months from 2 public clouds to 7 entities, and this is global. So we're dealing with data just like this from China to Europe to the Americas, so all around the world. This is us living that right now.
You know, it's interesting, Jamie, given the business Tenkata is in and the community that you serve, mission critical, resilience, very common theme. Given what you're going through and the transitions that your team is going through, where do you think, how do you think that recovery and backup fit into that model? Are they still relevant? Have they changed? And if so, how?
For us at least, backup is something that happens in the background, been relegated to, it's always been there. It's renewed, but we don't even go to our backup solution to do recoveries. We use Zerto for JFLR. That's our first line of defense against recovery. Finding the tool sets to span across the ecosystem is the difficulty. Again, it's fun to play in this environment and develop and to learn. But as you spread out, finding a single pane of glass, which is everyone's holy grail, to do all of these things becomes more and more difficult. I think making informed, intelligent decisions at the beginning to choose a product who themselves evolve, like Zerto, they have changed, they've seen what we've asked for, they've brought the ability to spread this product across our ecosystem. Even Microsoft spreading out with nano servers and using Honolulu to manage the nano servers across the ecosystem. Easy to deploy. You just have to start broadening what you're looking at and make informed, intelligent decisions to get embedded with the product who they themselves are also evolving to what we're trying to accomplish.
Given what you just mentioned, Jamie, some great points. Going back to one of the earlier slides around these converged requirements around cost, complexity, and capability, how do you, given what you just described, how do you feel that plays out, or in terms of your selection criteria, your implementation criteria, and your management criteria for that complex infrastructure that you and your team need to support on a day-to-day basis?
So in IT, we aren't concerned about costs. But as soon as we go to our chief information officer, he puts us in line with costs. So that is probably number 2 below functionality and the capability that it'll give you to spend time on more things. So if something costs a little more, but there's an exponential gain to it, so that the team, the people that are working on that have more time to go out and invest in other ideas, and I mean ideas that solve business critical purposes, not just going out there deploying things and see what happens, how they work, but it gives you an opportunity to go and explore. Otherwise, you're relegated to backup. The backup didn't finish. I need to change a tape. I got to fix the DLT library because the robotic arm failed. You don't have to do that stuff anymore. So you can actually go discover stuff that can make the business more profitable, more efficient, traditionally from a portion of the business that they just see as a money pit. So we become an addition to the business rather than a detraction on the P&L.
And I was just thinking too, Jamie, given the scope of what you're managing, going out to all those sites and running once a year, twice a year recovery exercises, I'm sure that's something you'd rather avoid. That are fair.
I don't know, man. I like traveling, so I go there. But
okay.
But now, since you can do it from anywhere in the world, I have to sit in my office in Atlanta and do it. So we can do failovers for Kuala Lumpur, sitting in Atlanta, failovers for Niverdal, and all right there with, again, single pane of glass. And as long as you pick the tools that accomplish that, and the company is committed to evolving with you, I think that's the best intelligent decision, as well as pairing with partners that you can tap into to get you out of those pigeonholes when you find yourself in them.
Given all that experience and perspective, Jamie, if you had 2 or 3 recommendations to provide to the attendees today on what they should be thinking about, what they should be doing, what would those be?
Number 1 is always develop a cloud strategy. I think a lot of times that's as far as we get. We never get past the development because it's changing so rapidly. Once you think you've defined a plan, 3 months later, it's evolved and changed. Now I've got to go reevaluate. I would say number 1, go do something. Take a chance. I'm not talking about moving production, going straight to production into any vendor, but do something. Get approval from someone to go out and say, let's start playing with these services. I would also say, like you were speaking to earlier, VMs will be around, but start looking at, once you get your workload into a cloud, dissolving that into PaaS solutions, offloading the compute, which will also make the P&L look a whole lot nicer. It'll be an addition from the IT team. Start taking on, the hardest part for me was the mentality. Start taking on the mentality that we've got to be the champions of change rather than telling everyone else we need to be agile. We ourselves have to adopt that ourselves, change our mentality, change our thought processes. And as we start to lead and take charge of that, the people behind us will start to say, yeah, that's working, that's applicable. I see that, let's try this. And it just grows and grows and grows from there. But don't get stuck on developing the plan forever and ever into infinity. Do something. Take one small step, and it will lead to much, much broader things that you can put into your environment and take advantage of.
We were talking earlier, Jamie, you also mentioned the importance of partnerships, vendor, provider partnerships. I was wondering if you could just say a few words about that.
Absolutely. So our first forte into it was formerly known as Peak 10. So we worked with them in the private cloud. We got our feet wet there. That was brought to us by our partner, was also Blue Ally. They brought us Zerto as well, so they are a strategic partner. And strategic partner, I mean someone who I've got their cell phone number on my cell phone, and they don't consider it a nuisance for me to call them and ask them what I consider a stupid question when they go, oh, you need to go to this area rather than that area and enable this functionality for password right back to work. And they've answered it 100 times where I ran into it for the first time and you're like, I don't know what to do. I've Googled, I've looked through KBs, I can't find the answer. And he's like, oh, go here, here, and here. So these guys become not only your partners, they become your friends, and they're willing to share that information because then you can go out and share that information, such as right here, and just keep the knowledge flowing, keep everybody in the loop. But strong partnerships, not just on the business level, but friend level, will get you through a whole lot of uh-ohs, and I shouldn't have done this.
Sounds good. Jamie, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Great
sir.
perspective.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Okay, so let me circle back to one of the points I made earlier, and I think Gil referenced this as well. Back in 2016, to be honest with you, I felt a bit like I was a voice crying out in the wilderness in Gartner with respect to resilience and IT resilience. And here it is 2 years later, and it's very clear that from a Gartner research coverage point of view, you see the key implication here, and that's playing out in a couple ways. One is a definition, a formal definition of what business resilience is all about. The focus here, protect, absorb, recover, and adapt. And especially when you look at resilience in all the different dimensions in which it can be implemented, all the way from corporate culture to what individual employees in the organizations need to do, to what the infrastructure and the applications need to do. That is a pretty lofty responsibility, and in many organizations, getting back to that question around responsibility and accountability, what I see and what many of my colleagues also see are chief risk officers taking a more dominant role in terms of driving down what needs to be done and who needs to do it. Great example, late last year, I was visiting with a large banking client, very well-known banking client in Europe. And what I was sitting in on was a global meeting of all the I&O leaders from across the world within that bank, 150 of them, and their objective for the 2 days that they were at corporate was very simple. Let's nail down what we're going to do around resilience. Let's identify who's responsible, and let's get on with it. And you say, well, okay, that's all well and good, but so what? Well, this bank had a very interesting premise. to get the initiative started. What they were saying is, look, we want to get to a business model where we're providing financial services for customers where we know none of the assets. That's a different model. But how are you going to distinguish yourself? Well, if it's not necessarily on the size of the assets you own, it's going to be the quality of service you deliver. And that's why, and that's just one micro example of how significant and how vital to that particular organization's business a global enterprise-wide strategy could be. And again, driven by the chief risk officer in tandem with the CIO. They were the co-sponsors there. They were the go-to folks for driving this down and making it happen. But that particular example has been happening in a lot of organizations, in financials, in healthcare, in retail. And over the course of 2017, a lot of my colleagues in Gartner research began to see that as well, especially in the context of cyber resilience, protection, mitigation of cyber attacks. They were seeing it come up quite significantly. But the themes in terms of recover, adapt, absorb are very key, because that's different from the classic recovery model. The recovery model we're all used to was very RTO, RPO based. What we're talking about here is the means by which you either bypass or resolve the aftermath of a disruptive event that has direct impact on business operations. So, yes, technologies like orchestration automation are key, but at the same time, the means to be able to operate, to utilize intelligence that's been built up around what could go wrong, to act upon that, and to take the logical set of next steps to restore operations becomes increasingly important. And so when we look at the resilience model, the governance model, what organizations like this bank are implementing, you can see where it starts at the top in terms of a culture of trust. This is the reason why we need resiliency. Now, it may not be in terms of a change of the business, or here's what we want to do, here's what we want to become. It can also be the case where a senior executive decision is made to either mostly or entirely transition production operations into the cloud. And I've worked with a major media and entertainment company who's done just that. So they were on an 18-month march to move an infrastructure of 800 servers, about 400 terabytes from production data centers into the cloud. The point is that resilience in both cases was very germane. The focus at a top level is around confidentiality, integrity, availability, and safety. Obviously, availability for the application services, confidentiality and integrity for the data, and safety for the employees, all of whom had a stake in making a corporate resilience initiative work. So that brings up a number of transformations that you see here in terms of becoming facilitators, focusing on information flow, very much related to what's happening in the context of that ecosystem model that we talked about earlier. But here's the big difference, because you look at the bottom part of the triangle or the pyramid, and you see 4 areas. You see predict, prevent, detect, and respond. Now, I think we've been reasonably good as an industry around, to some extent, predicting and preventing. What's new and where the opportunity is in the area of detect and respond. And what's happening there is that is pulling through a lot of innovation we see going on with many software vendors around how do we best leverage and do deeper drill downs on operations analytics. What's happening? I know IBM, for example, They, if I recall the stat correctly, they have the equivalent of 23 million days of customers' operational data that they do continuous analytics on as part of delivering their global resilience services. Just one example. But when it comes to the technology by which you detect and respond, all of a sudden analytics and machine learning and intelligent actions, not by themselves, but in conjunction with members of the IT support team supporting a whole new level of business resilience, then becomes possible. So not that IT's mission goes away necessarily, but IT's mission changes and supported by a whole new level of technology that we really haven't seen in any broad way up to this point. So that's one point. Secondly, in the spirit of the voice crying out over the wilderness, over the course of 2017, I spent a lot of time on client inquiries, going to Gartner summits, one-on-ones, talking about resilience and saying, what is the critical mass? How do organizations get started? Because quite honestly, when organizations and IT teams hear resilience, their eyes roll, they glaze over. Where do I start? What do I need to do? So that's what my mission 2017 was, to define how do we get from that triangle on the previous slide to what we're seeing here. Now you say, okay, cool, so what's the surfer doing? Well, the surfer, the significance of the surfer is this. As you can see in the diagram, the wave is much bigger than the surfer. However, the surfer, in order to develop his skill, he needed to start somewhere. He needed to get his board, he needed to learn how to surf 1 or 2 or 3 foot waves to get to where he is in the diagram, and clearly that's years of experience. Same thing with resilience. It's not a 1 or 2 quarter initiative. It's really knowing where to start, what the focus should be from a business process, application, and data point of view, and what needs to be implemented. So what you see here in these bullets is the collective intelligence that I receive from Gartner clients. Certainly the continuous operations, but also to emphasize the importance around sustainable data integrity. Got a lot of feedback around backup, what was good about it, how it can be extended, but also what was its role in mitigating cyber attacks. And at the same time, from a resilience point of view, it's not just continuous availability and data integrity protection. Those are important. But the other part of it too is agility. And when we were here at ZertoCon 1 and we began to have a discussion around resilience, agility, at least for me, wasn't even part of the discussion. But obviously, you look at the DevOps model, the DevSecOps model, why organizations transition into public cloud to begin with, and you can see that provisioning, change, management, agility becomes really important. Example, that media company that I mentioned, they had, when they were making the transition into AWS, they still had good old IT metrics that they were being measured on. Availability, mean time to respond, mean time between failures. But all of a sudden, there was a new metric around provisioning, rapidly provisioning copies of data in the cloud that had to be done within the matter of an hour at most. Why? Because that organization in particular had development teams that were rapidly developing services in parallel, all of whom were competing to deliver the same service, all of whom needed pretty much the same copies of data at the same time. And so now this new metric for IT was mean time to provision data copies. The business objective was to sustain, if not improve, the productivity of the service development teams. So this represents the short list, But the other part of it that's important too is to look at the scope. And once again, what we're seeing here is from Gartner clients, when asked the question, where do you see your operations in 3 to 5 years? Is it going to be all public? Is it going to be all private? Is it going to be a mix? And as you can see here, nearly 80% of organizations, and now granted, many of these organizations that we see at Gartner Summits do tend to be from larger enterprises. So this does represent a bit of a larger enterprise perspective. But at the same time, given that many organizations have found that for them, lift and shift may not be cost effective in all cases. There may be the needs from a security and privacy, GDPR support to maintain some of that data internally. Whatever reason, it's clear that not only is the scope of digital business hybrid, but the scope of IT resilience management, the end-to-end, from production data center to cloud, from cloud to production data center, and cloud to cloud, applies. And I think we're only in the very early days of beginning to make that happen. But managing IT resilience without looking at addressing most, if not all, of the objectives on the previous slide, for most organizations, just simply won't cut it. So here's the other change that's happening. I talked earlier about the changes in service levels, focus on business process. And one of the areas that's really active within our CIO research team right now is what's called business or outcome-based service levels. And some of you may be familiar with it. Have a really simple example here, again, taken from an actual client instance. But in their particular case, they had a key target that they need to hit. They had several, but this was one of them. And the KPI, the performance metric, was increase the percentage of customer interactions that are entirely digital versus customer interactions that come over the phone or that come in on person-to-person basis, whatever it has to be. So here, the baseline in 2018 was at 35% of the customer interactions being digital. The objective from a business improvement point of view and a digital business delivery point of view was to increase that from 35% to 50% by 2020. So that was the business performance improvement objective. The outcome-based SLA is, you see here in the red, meaning that the improvement in availability, not just for its own sake, but the improvement in availability needs to be correlated with the improvement in the customer interactions that are digital. And that's going to take some time to fully implement. And not just relating service levels to business performance, but also analyzing what can get in the way. What are the problems? Going back to an example around supply chain and the percentage of supply chain availability, how that impacts revenue, but understanding the factors that can get in the way. So that's an evolutionary step that we need to take as an industry. But what's happening as a result is that we're seeing a lot of product convergence going on. In particular, right now, as Gil mentioned, we have a Magic Quadrant going on for IT resilience assurance. And here, I have a diagram of all these different management software types converging into this common target. You say, okay, sounds kind of academic. Well, this really represents the participants in the Magic Quadrant. All different areas, they see it, they get it, and interestingly, a third of the participants are companies whose classic focus was, yep, you guessed it, backup. They see the opportunity, they see how they have to extend what they do and build upon what they do if they're going to be successful and competitive in this new digital business and digital transformation environment. So here, within the context of the Magic Quadrant, you can see the set of requirements, but one of the biggest challenges, I'll focus on two. The end-to-end availability and performance assurance, and also data integrity assurance between production data center and cloud, cloud and production data center, and cloud to cloud. That's where you begin to need more advanced technology, especially in mining of analytics, doing deeper dives on analytics, and machine learning. That's where several of these vendors have already taken the first initial steps, have developed some initial capabilities, and they're saying, by the way, we know we can't do all this on our own. To recreate this all-singing, all-dancing resilience management platform is going to be tough to do. So what they have done is said, look, in order to detect and respond, why can't we leverage the APIs of other management software vendors, operations management, performance management, and use those APIs to extend our capability to provide early warnings as far as contingencies, availability triggers, whatever it happens to be. And that's what we're really seeing in terms of the ahas from a functional point of view. But what we're also learning in terms of the resilience assurance is that it's not just about, as you could see from the previous slide, it's not about backup. It's not about runbook automation. It's not about just cyber attack mitigation, et cetera. It's all of the above. And there's a huge opportunity out there. One of the big ahas for me personally was in 2017, I wrote a market guide for what I called IT resilience orchestration. And at the beginning of the year, our senior researchers came back and said, John, you know what? Orchestration is a mechanism. What is the benefit of this technology? How do you connote the benefit? And that's where the term assurance was born. Knowing that there were changes going on in service levels, changes going on in terms of the capability, the scope of capability, that's why we adjusted the name that we use in the market guide to the Magic Quadrant. And also, another aha for me is, back in 2017, I reported this segment as being about $384 million. This year, when I totaled up all the vendors' revenues, assuming, of course, they're telling me the truth, came up with $800 million, but also a medium growth rate in average deal size of about 40%. This segment is growing rapidly for very good reasons and for many of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So what is the action plan? Now, this action plan, as you can see, is around general resilience. But let me get more specific and build upon some of the points that Jamie was mentioning. You can look at resilience as this galactic initiative that's someone else's problem, someone else's challenge. Or you can look at resilience and IT resilience in the context of that functionality that I listed in terms of the cyber attack mitigation, the data integrity protection, the end-to-end performance assurance. Ask the question, which of these capabilities do I need? More importantly, which of these capabilities does my business need? How do I best get started with those capabilities? What should I do next? And for Jamie's point, what partners should become involved in making this all happen? In addition to Jamie's recommendations, that would be my main recommendations for each of the attendees here. And that is all I have to say. I thank you very much for your attention, and I am going to turn the floor back over to my esteemed colleague, Mr. Gill. Gill, over to you.
First of all, thank you. Do you have the microphone on?